Hello, dear viewers. Today I would like to take you on a journey into the depths of time. Are you ready to hear stories from distant lands, unknown seas, and mysterious forests? Oh, how exciting! Today I will tell you about the adventures of the Vikings, the raids that swept across Europe, the world of the knights, the bastion of feudalism, and the epic struggle of Alfred the Great, the determined King of England. First of all, close your eyes and feel the cold north winds on your face. This is the homeland of the Vikings. The sky is gray, the sea is rough, and the land is harsh. Born into these harsh conditions, the Vikings were brave warriors, skilled sailors and skillful traders. Their adventures were not limited to Scandinavia, they reached the heart of Europe. You can't wait to find out how the Vikings lived, fought and left their mark, can you? Oh, and then we will touch on that complex social structure of the Middle Ages, feudalism and chivalry. Feudalism was a system based on land and loyalty. Every lord, every vassal, and every peasant had a place in this system. But perhaps the most notable were the noble and noble-minded knights. These heroic warriors appeared not only on the battlefields but also in romantic stories. Stepping into their world of honor and courage will fascinate you. Finally, we turn our eyes to England. Alfred the Great's fight against the Vikings changed the fate not only of England but of the whole of Europe. His strategic genius, courage and determination became the symbol of resistance against the Viking raids. Alfred's life and struggle will take you back to those turbulent days of history. Now, are you ready to dive into these exciting stories? I can't wait to step into the world of the Vikings and discover their brave and adventurous lives. If you are ready, let's begin. The Vikings originated in what is now Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. The climate and geography of these countries deeply influenced the Vikings' way of life. Close your eyes and imagine looking out over the steep-sided fjords of Norway on a cold, windy day. At the foot of the snow-capped mountains are narrow valleys leading down into icy waters. The flat and fertile lands of Denmark, while ideal for agriculture, offered a perfect harbor for the Vikings, whose lives were intertwined with the sea. Sweden's deep forests and vast lakes provide rich resources for both hunting and fishing. In this harsh geography, people had to be brave, strong, and resilient to survive. The harsh climate, long winter nights, and short summer days strengthened the Vikings' physical and mental strength. These harsh conditions made them the rulers of the seas and the feared dream of Europe. Viking society was based on families and clans. Each clan consisted of one or several large families, headed by a jarl, usually the oldest and most experienced male. The jarl was both the leader and the protector of the clan. As everyone knows, loyalty and honor were the most important values among Vikings. For this reason, clan members were close-knit and would stand by each other in times of need. Honor and loyalty were also important in inter-clan relations. Vikings gathered in public assemblies called Thing to settle disputes among themselves. In these assemblies, everyone had a say and decisions were taken collectively. This democratic structure was one of the cornerstones of the Viking social order. Now, let's take a look at the daily life of the Vikings. Agriculture, trade, and seafaring were an integral part of their lives. The Vikings made a living by farming in the rugged terrain of Norway, the fertile plains of Denmark, and the vast forests of Sweden. They grew cereals such as barley, wheat, and oats, and raised livestock to produce milk, cheese, and meat. However, in these lands where agriculture was limited, the Vikings also made a living through trade and seafaring. Ah, my dear viewers, the adventures of the Vikings on the seas transformed them from a purely agricultural society into masters of trade. They sailed to distant lands, battling the raging waves of the North Sea. They made discoveries in the North Atlantic, as far as Greenland and even the Americas. They mastered maritime trade, reaching many ports in Europe. These brave sailors were not just plunderers, but also skillful traders. They carried valuable furs, slaves, and exotic goods all over Europe. The Vikings were also great craftsmen. They were masters of woodworking, blacksmithing, and shipbuilding. Their long ships, these elegant and fast boats called longships, gave them a great advantage in both trade and war. Viking ships could cross rivers and reach as far as the interior of Europe. In this way, they had a wide sphere of influence, not only in coastal cities but also inland. In their daily lives, the Vikings were both a warlike and peaceful people. They cultivated their land, raised their children, told stories, and worshipped their gods. There was great love and respect within the family. They told their legends and stories in the long winter nights by the fire and kept their culture alive by passing it down from generation to generation. Dear viewers, the origins and social structure of the Vikings give us important clues to understand what kind of warriors and traders they were. Now, are you ready to take a closer look at the raids of this brave and adventurous people in Europe and the traces they left behind? So, before we dive into the stories of the Vikings' raids in Europe, let's get to know them a little better. In the world of the Vikings, under every stone, in the shade of every tree, in the waves of every stormy sea, gods and legends ruled. Norse mythology was a belief system that shaped their lives, gave meaning to their daily lives, and gave them courage on the battlefield. In Norse mythology, the major gods lived in a place called Asgard. Asgard was the home of the gods and one of the branches of the great world tree called Yggdrasil. Odin was the father of all the gods and the god of wisdom. Sacrificing one eye to drink from the fountain of wisdom, Odin was also the god of war and victory. Next to him, Thor, known for his hammer, was the god of lightning and thunder. Thor was a powerful warrior who fought giants and protected people. Freyja was the goddess of love and beauty, but also a courageous leader in battle. Loki was also known as the trickster god, a master of cunning and change. His legends were sometimes tragic, sometimes comic, but always intriguing. Legends played a big role in the life of the Vikings. Ragnarok was a legend about the end of the world and the final battle of the gods. It told of a great destruction and rebirth that went down to the roots of the world tree. These epics were both frightening and hopeful, because they reminded us that every end is a new beginning. The Vikings practiced various rituals and sacrifices to show their devotion to their gods. These rituals were performed to ask the gods for blessings, victory, or protection. Many rituals were performed on major holidays or special occasions. Sacrificial rites, called blot, were one of the most important rituals to make offerings to the gods. In these rituals, animals, especially pigs and goats, were offered to the gods. Sometimes human sacrifices were also offered from enemies won in battles. Sacrifice rituals were major events that brought the community together. In these rituals, the shedding of blood on the ground and offering it to the gods was an important symbol for the continuation of the cycle of nature. At the same time, these rituals reinforced the unity and solidarity of the community. The Vikings used a type of shamanistic magic called cider to communicate with the gods. Practitioners of cider were sorcerers who were believed to have the ability to see the future and communicate with spirits. These magicians were highly respected in society and advised on important decisions. The Vikings' first contact with Christianity took place in the late 8th century. During this period, Vikings were introduced to Christianity during their raids in various parts of Europe. Initially, Christian priests and monks were weak and vulnerable figures in the eyes of the Vikings. However, over time, the teachings and rituals of this new religion began to gain traction among the Vikings. The conversion of the Vikings to Christianity was a slow and painful process. The first Christian Vikings were often converted to Christianity through trade relations and political alliances. For example, King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark was one of the first major Viking leaders to convert to Christianity in the 10th century. His conversion played an important role in the spread of Christianity in Scandinavia. Although Christianity contradicted the Vikings' old beliefs, over time the teachings of these two religions began to coexist. Many Vikings remained loyal to their old gods even after they had converted to Christianity. Christianity had a profound impact on the Vikings' way of life, culture, and social structure. Churches were built, Christian holidays were celebrated, and Christianity became part of the Vikings' daily life. My dear viewers, the Vikings' religion and belief systems are the cornerstones of their identity and culture. These beliefs fueled their courage, resilience, and spirit of exploration. The greatest secret behind the Vikings' success was undoubtedly their ingenious construction of ships. These ships were not only the vehicles that carried them across Europe, they were also a symbol of the Vikings' identity and power. The long ships called drakkars were the Vikings' warships. These ships were named after the dragon heads on the bow. The dragon heads were carved to strike fear into their enemies and to pay homage to the gods of the sea. Drakkars were fast and agile ships thanks to their long and narrow structure. This made them maneuverable both on rivers and on the high seas. A drakkar usually had between 30 and 50 oarsmen, lined up on either side, which increased the speed and power of the ship. The sails were made of colorful fabrics and had a large surface to catch the wind. Nar were the Vikings' ships of trade and exploration. These ships were wider and deeper, which allowed them to carry a large amount of cargo. Nar were durable and reliable ships in the rough waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The Vikings explored Greenland, Iceland, and even as far as North America on the Nair. These ships allowed the Vikings to expand their trading networks and colonize new lands. The Vikings' seafaring skills, combined with their courage and spirit of adventure, made them one of the world's greatest explorers. Starting from the craggy coast of Norway, the Vikings spread across Europe. They reached England, France, Ireland, and even the interior of Russia. In each voyage, they set sail to conquer new lands, trade, or establish new settlements. The Vikings discovered many new lands thanks to their mastery of the seas. One of the most famous Viking explorers, Leif Erikson, reached North America around 1000. This land, which they called Vinland, was located in what is now Newfoundland in Canada. Leif Erikson and his men stayed here for a while and made a living by trading with the local people. However, for various reasons, this settlement did not last long, and the Vikings eventually left Vinland. The Vikings' explorations were not limited to new lands. They also discovered and expanded the trade routes across the seas. The Vikings established a vast trade network stretching from Eastern Europe to the Middle East. Through this trade network, furs, spices, metals, and other valuables were brought to Viking lands. Likewise, the Vikings sold their own products to these distant lands. The seafaring and exploration of the Vikings shows not only their warrior spirit, but also their skill as traders and explorers. These brave sailors spread all over the world and left their mark wherever they went. Their adventures will be told throughout history and remembered for generations. My dear audience, what I have told you about the ships and exploration of the Vikings has shown you what a great seafaring people they were. Now, are you ready to take a closer look at the raids of these brave warriors on Europe and their impact on the continent? Let's continue with stories of how the Vikings conquered Europe and what happened along the way. In the craggy and cold lands of Scandinavia, the Vikings are known as one of history's greatest seafarers. However, it was not only the search for adventure that drove them to the seas. Scandinavia's harsh climate, limited agricultural land, and growing population led the Vikings to seek new lands and riches. One of the Vikings' first targets was the rich and fertile lands of Britain. The coastal villages and monasteries of Britain attracted the attention of the Vikings. The riches of the Christian monasteries, full of gold and silver treasures, made them attractive targets for the Vikings. In 793, the attack on Lindisfarne Abbey was the first major Viking raid on Britain. The attack shocked Britain and made the cruelty of the Vikings known throughout Europe. This bloody attack at Lindisfarne showed how organized and effective the Vikings were. After this attack, the Vikings sacked many villages and monasteries along the British coast. The vulnerable coastal towns of Britain were easy targets for the Vikings to conquer and plunder. With their fast-moving ships, the Vikings could quickly leave the places they attacked and carry the spoils to safe harbors. Ireland also became a target for the Vikings. Ireland's small kingdoms and monasteries promised plenty of booty for the Vikings. In 795, the Vikings reached the northern coast of Ireland, where they sacked many villages. The Vikings began to establish permanent settlements in Ireland and captured important trading centers such as Dublin. Dublin was strategically important for the Vikings, from where they could easily organize expeditions to England, Scotland, and other parts of Europe. The Vikings' campaigns in Europe were not limited to Britain and Ireland. They advanced as far as the interior of Europe. In the 840s, the Vikings attacked the northern coast of France. Even Paris suffered its share of Viking attacks. In 845, Bjorn Ironside, son of the Viking leader Ragnar Lodbrok, attacked Paris and captured the city. This attack forced the Frankish kingdom to make a deal with the Vikings, and they had to pay a large ransom. The Vikings' expeditions were not only after loot and booty, they also began to colonize new lands. The Danelaw region in the northeast of England came under the control of the Vikings, and they established permanent settlements there. These settlements allowed the Vikings to bring their agriculture, trade, and cultural influence to Britain. Dear friends, these early voyages of the Vikings from Scandinavia to Europe demonstrate their courage, seafaring skills, and strategic genius. The Vikings left their mark on European history not only as warriors, but also as traders and colonizers. Now, we will continue to delve deeper into the impact of the Vikings' voyages on Europe and the legacy they left behind. Get ready, because the story of the Vikings is just beginning. Who hasn't heard of Leif Erikson? He is famous among the Vikings not only for his bravery but also for his explorations. Leif Erikson's story begins with his father Eric the Red's dangerous journey to Greenland. After being exiled from Iceland, Eric the Red sailed westward to unknown lands and eventually reached the icy shores of Greenland. He established a settlement in this cold but fertile land, marking the Vikings' first step into Greenland. Eric the Red's son Leif decided to follow in his father's footsteps. But Leif's goal was beyond the Greenland his father had discovered. According to legends, Leif Erikson had heard that there were uncharted lands even further to the west. These unknown lands fired the imagination of the Vikings. Leif Erikson gathered a brave crew and sailed westward. The voyage took them far beyond the west coast of Greenland and into the vast waters of the Atlantic Ocean. After days of hard sailing, land finally appeared on the horizon. When Leif and his crew set foot on this new land, they found a completely different world. They named this new land Vinland, a fertile land covered with vineyards. Vinland was located in what is now North America, and Leif Erikson was the first European to set foot on the continent. The Vikings established a settlement here, albeit for a short time. Vinland's fertile land was a great opportunity for the Vikings to farm and hunt. However, establishing a permanent settlement here was a challenge. They encountered the local people, the Indians, and these encounters were often not peaceful. Conflicts made it difficult for the Vikings to establish a permanent colony in Vinland. During their time in Vinland, Leif Erikson and his crew discovered the natural riches this new world had to offer. Vineyards, rivers full of fish and game dazzled the Vikings. However, the Vikings' warrior spirit and conflicts with the local people prevented them from staying long in this new land. After a while, the Vikings were forced to leave Vinland and return to Greenland. But Leif Erikson's discovery has gone down in history as proof of how brave and adventurous the Vikings were. These expeditions to Greenland and North America show how far-sighted and brave sailors the Vikings were. Their courage not only led them to discover new lands, but also left an important mark on world history. Leif Erikson's epic voyage symbolizes the Vikings' spirit of exploration and their passion for new horizons. Dear friends, this story of the Vikings is one of the best examples of how courage and adventurousness can lead to great achievements. Dear friends, close your eyes and immerse yourself in the dark and foggy atmosphere of the Middle Ages. The air is cool, the seas are choppy, and cold winds from the north caress your face. It is in this setting that the story of the Vikings begins. The brave sailors of the Vikings left their mark on history with the sharpness of their swords and the ferocity of their raids. Now I will tell you the story of the Lindisfarne Raid, one of the most feared and unforgettable events of the Vikings' raids into Europe. The year was 793, and there were long, thin ships sailing in the cold waters of the northern seas. With unprecedented speed and agility, these ships were sailing towards the northeast coast of England. The island of Lindisfarne was their target. Lindisfarne was known as a sacred island, and there was a monastery here. The monastery was both a religious center and a great storehouse of wealth. One morning, just before sunrise, the inhabitants of Lindisfarne noticed these tall ships appearing in the sea. The ships were approaching the shore, breaking the silence of the sea. Warriors stepped out of the ships, eyes shining under their helmets, axes and swords in their hands. These warriors were Vikings. The Lindisfarne raid began in an instant. The Vikings ruthlessly attacked the monastery. While the monks tried to protect their holy books and precious treasures, the Vikings burned everything in their path. The monastery's gold and silver treasures were looted, and the monks were killed or taken away as slaves. This attack caused great horror in medieval Europe. Lindisfarne marked the beginning of the Viking raids across Europe. The Lindisfarne raid was just the beginning. After this raid, the Vikings continued to raid all over Europe. These warriors from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden used their fast-moving ships to reach England, France, Germany, and even the Mediterranean coast. The Vikings' raids caused great fear and anxiety among the local people. Villages and towns were vulnerable to Viking raids. The raids of the Vikings brought not only plunder and destruction, they also profoundly affected the political and social structure of Europe. In some areas, the Vikings established permanent settlements and mingled with the local populations. Normandy came under Viking control in this way, and a strong Viking settlement was established there. England developed strong defenses to resist Viking raids, and this process played an important role in shaping the English nation. The impact of the Vikings on Europe was not limited to war and destruction. Cultural and commercial interactions also increased with the Vikings' raids. Wherever they went, the Vikings traded with local peoples and spread their own culture and traditions. These interactions increased the cultural diversity of Europe and built bridges between different peoples. Dear friends, the raids of the Vikings occupy an important place in the dark pages of history. While the Lindisfarne raid marked the beginning of these raids, their impact on Europe was felt for centuries. The Vikings' bravery and warriorship made them one of the most unforgettable figures in history. The Vikings' dominance of the seas was profoundly influenced by their raids across Europe. These warriors of the north terrorized not only the northern coast of England, but also the fertile lands of France and the green valleys of Ireland. With their spirit of exploration and warlike nature, the Vikings took these corners of Europe by storm. On the northern coast of France, especially along the Seine and Loire rivers, the Vikings became a household name. In 845, the Vikings laid siege to Paris, causing extensive damage to the city walls. Paris' efforts to defend itself were inadequate. The city was sacked, its inhabitants fled in fear, and this event caused France to reconsider its defense strategies. This first major raid by the Vikings led the French government to start developing strategies to protect its coasts. The north and east coasts of England became a target for the Vikings. In 865, a group of Vikings known as the Great Norse Army arrived in England. The leaders of this army were determined to conquer the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England. Large cities such as York and Northumbria became targets for Viking raids. The Viking settlements established in these areas changed the social and economic structure of the region. These Viking raids into England radically affected England's defense strategies and military organization. When we look at Ireland, the impact of the Vikings was quite profound. The first Viking raids on the coast of Ireland took place in 795. These raids were particularly directed against important port cities such as Dublin. The Vikings advanced into the interior of Ireland and established settlements. Dublin became the most important base for the Vikings in Ireland. Ireland's traditional way of life was changed by the impact of the Vikings on the island. The Irish had to develop their own defense strategies to fight the Vikings. Europe developed various defense strategies against the terrible raids of the Vikings. At first, local villages and cities were vulnerable to the Vikings' rapid raids, but over time different methods were developed to counter these attacks. France began to build stronger fortifications and castles against the Vikings' attacks. These defensive structures made it harder for the Vikings to sack the cities. In addition, the government of France started to be ready for possible attacks by establishing military garrisons in coastal areas. In England, defense strategies underwent a significant shift, especially under the leadership of Alfred the Great's government. Alfred developed a series of strategies for defense. These included organizing local military units and strengthening defensive systems. Alfred also built better fortifications and castles to defend cities. In Ireland, too, various strategies were developed to counter Viking raids. The local kings of Ireland organized a series of military campaigns against the Vikings. Also, defensive castles and fortifications were built in Ireland to reduce the influence of the Vikings in the interior. Dear listeners, the impact of the Vikings on France, England, and Ireland profoundly influenced the history of these regions. These warriors changed not only their conquests, but also the defense strategies and military organization of the local peoples. Europe's response to these raids shaped the continent's future defense strategies. Dear listeners, I am taking you on a journey into the depths of history to tell you about the impact of the Vikings, the warriors of the North, on Britain. Today I will tell you about the impact of the Vikings on Britain and how these warriors established kingdoms, built their settlements, and shaped the history of Britain. Relax and get ready to dive into these unforgettable moments of history. Once upon a time, sea warriors from the north landed mightily on the green shores of Britain. These sea voyages left their mark not only on the seas, but also deep in the pages of history. We will focus on the story of the settlements and kingdoms the Vikings established in Britain, and how these warriors made an impact and shaped the history of the region. The Danelaw is one of the Vikings' most significant influences in Britain. Danelaw is the name of the territorial governments that the Vikings, especially the Danes, established across much of Britain in the 9th and 10th centuries. The establishment of the Danelaw began as the Vikings consolidated their military and political dominance in this region. These territories strengthened the Vikings' presence in Britain and radically changed the cultural and political landscape of the region. The emergence of the Danelaw dates back to the Treaty of Verdun in 878 between Alfred the Great and the Viking leader Guthrum. This treaty allowed the Vikings to control large parts of England. This land became a territory where the Vikings imposed their own laws and forms of government. The Vikings practiced their own legal system and cultural traditions in the Danelaw region, which led to its separation from the rest of England. Viking settlements in the Danelaw led to the rapid development and growth of these lands. The Vikings established villages and towns in these areas. York became an important Viking center during this period. The city became the center of the Viking cult and their system of government. These settlements resulted in Vikings interacting with the local population, trading and contributing to the economic structure of the region. Danelaw's influence was felt in other parts of the north of England and changed the cultural landscape of the region. Other kingdoms founded by the Vikings profoundly influenced the history of Britain. Among the most important of these were the kingdoms founded by the Norwegian Vikings. These kingdoms were influential in different parts of Britain and consolidated the influence of the Vikings on Britain. The Norwegian Vikings made a significant contribution to the history of these lands by establishing their own rule, especially in the northern regions of Scotland and Ireland. During this period, the impact of the Vikings on Britain was not only military and political, but also cultural and economic. The Vikings brought their cultural values and traditions to the land. Danelaw and other Viking settlements contributed to Britain's cultural richness. The trade routes and markets created by the Vikings shaped the economic structure of Britain and strengthened its relations with other European countries. My dear listeners, the settlement of the Vikings in Britain and the kingdoms they established radically changed the history of this region. These warriors made a significant contribution to Britain's history, not only through their conquests, but also through their cultural and economic impact. Long ago, the Vikings, the warriors of the north, were known as the masters of the seas. These warriors were renowned for their skill and courage on the seas. Born in the cold waters of Norway and Denmark, these warriors had a bold spirit of exploration. They crossed stormy oceans, reached distant lands, and left their mark on history. This story tells how the Vikings crossed the seas into Normandy, France, where they established a powerful duchy. In the early 9th century, Viking raids on the northern coast of France had a profound impact on the political and social structure of the region. These raids increased the Vikings' influence in the region and paved the way for them to establish a new presence in the north of France. This region of France was named Normandy by the Vikings. Normandy was a name that meant place of the people of the north. The Vikings decided to settle in this land and set up their own administration. The foundation of the Duchy of Normandy took place in 911, and this event marked a turning point in the Vikings' influence in Europe. That year, Rollo, the leader of the Vikings, made a treaty with King Charles the Simple of France. This treaty allowed the Vikings to gain territory in the north of France. Rollo and his men pledged their loyalty to the King of France and began to settle these lands. The lands given to Rollo became what would later be known as the Duchy of Normandy. Under Rollo's leadership, this Viking settlement grew into a powerful duchy. When Rollo's descendants ruled these lands, the influence of the Duchy of Normandy spread to other parts of France. It became not only a military power but also a cultural and political one. The Duchy of Normandy became an important part of French history and profoundly influenced the governance, economy, and culture of the region. The influence of the Duchy of Normandy was not limited to France. In 1066, William the Conqueror, heir to the Duchy of Normandy, conquered England. This was an important turning point in the history of England, and the Normans' influence over England lasted for many years. William's conquest of England consolidated the Duchy of Normandy's influence over Europe and further emphasized the role of the Vikings on the stage of history. The founding of the Duchy of Normandy is a success story that demonstrates not only the Vikings' dominance at sea, but also their influence on land. The Vikings used their skill and courage on sea voyages on the land of Europe, leaving a lasting mark. The foundation of the Duchy of Normandy is just one of the important roles of the Vikings in European history. And this story has left a deep mark on the pages of history. The Vikings' adventures at sea were not limited to raids. Beyond the seas, these brave warriors of the north set foot on the rich lands of Ireland and Scotland and left a lasting mark. Each raid, each settlement, tells the story of how the Vikings left their mark on these lands and shaped their place in history. The first Viking raids on Ireland's green lands date back to the mid-8th century. The Vikings landed on the west coast of Ireland and established permanent settlements here. Dublin, in particular, became one of the most prominent examples of the Vikings' influence on this land. Founded in 841, Dublin was the first permanent settlement of the Vikings in Ireland, and over time the city became an important trading center. The Vikings built Dublin not only as a settlement, but also as the economic and military center of the region. The influence of Viking culture can be traced in this city, for example. Archaeological finds in the city show how the Vikings lived in this land. Other important Viking settlements in Ireland include Limerick and Waterford. These cities show how the Vikings used their seafaring and trading skills to influence and leave a lasting mark on these lands. With the castles and trade routes they built in these cities, the Vikings created significant changes in the political and economic structure of Ireland. Now let's move on to this cold and mountainous land of Scotland. Information about when Scotland was first discovered by the Vikings dates back to the 8th century. The settlements in Scotland, especially on the islands of Orkney and Shetland, were an indication of the Vikings' interest in these lands. The Orkney Islands became one of the first permanent settlements of the Vikings in Scotland. The cultural and social impact of the Vikings on these islands is documented by many archaeological finds that have survived to the present day. The Shetland Islands also played an important role in Viking settlements. On these islands you can trace the traces of Viking settlement stone structures. Tombstones and other archaeological finds are important clues about how the Vikings lived on these islands. The Vikings not only established settlements in these regions, but also interacted with the local people, and these interactions led to cultural changes in the region. Viking settlements in Ireland and Scotland show how local cultures and communities in these regions were changed by Viking influence. The Vikings left a lasting mark on these lands, not only as warriors but also as traders and settlers. The history of Ireland and Scotland has been shaped by the lasting impact of the Vikings on these lands, and these interactions have contributed significantly to the cultural richness of the region. Although the Vikings are known as brave warriors who dominated the seas, they also profoundly influenced the course of history with their cultural legacy. Through language, art, literature, and archaeological finds, their legacy has survived to the present day and has gained a firm foothold in the modern world. We will now take an in-depth exploration of the cultural heritage of the Vikings. The language of the Vikings is known as Old Norse, and it is an important part of their cultural heritage. Old Norse is the ancestor of languages like Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish today. The Vikings passed down their history and stories of heroism through poems, epics, and legends written in their own language. The best known of these works are the so-called Edda poems and the saga. The Edda poems offer deep insights into gods, heroes, and legends. Especially the poetic Edda and the prosa Edda are the main sources of Viking mythology and Old Norse culture. These poems tell the stories of gods such as Thor, Odin, and Loki, and reflect the Vikings' belief systems. The art of the Vikings also reflects their cultural heritage. Dragons, forest spirits, and gods are common motifs in their art. The decorations on Viking ships and stones reveal their aesthetic sense and symbolism. Especially the runic stones are of great importance in understanding the writing system of the Vikings and how this system was used. Runic stones were often erected as memorial stones, with inscriptions describing important events, heroic deeds, or the Vikings' belief in the gods. Viking literature developed alongside these sagas and poems. In the sagas, family stories, battles, and discoveries are described in detail. These literary works help us to understand the Vikings' daily life, social structure, and cultural values. Especially works such as the Engjal Saga and the Eagle Saga are important sources that describe the complex social relations and heroic stories of the Vikings. In today's world, the cultural heritage of the Vikings is still influential. Especially in Northern Europe, traces of the Vikings can be observed culturally, linguistically, and even genetically. In modern Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, the Viking heritage is evident in both everyday life and cultural celebrations. Viking-themed festivals, reenactments, and cultural events are some of the ways to keep this heritage alive. The mythological figures of the Vikings have also gained an important place in popular culture. The heroic stories, mythology, and battles of the Vikings are frequently depicted in movies and TV series. Especially productions such as the TV series Vikings and The Last Kingdom introduce the historical and cultural heritage of the Vikings to modern audiences. The cultural influence of the Vikings is also reflected in language. Modern languages contain many words and terms originating from Old Norse. Especially nautical, military terms, and some words used in everyday life reflect the linguistic heritage of the Vikings. In addition, Viking names and surnames are common, especially in Northern Europe, and are an important part of the Viking heritage that has survived to the present day. Archaeological finds are an important source for understanding the perception of Vikings today. Tombstones, shipwrecks, settlements, and various everyday objects have been found in excavations about the Vikings. These finds help us understand the Vikings' lifestyle, beliefs, and social structure. In particular, the Oseberg and Gokstad ship burials provide a detailed account of the Vikings' seafaring skills and funeral rites. These archaeological finds show that the Vikings were not only warriors, but also intelligent and resourceful people. The buried objects and decorations reflect the rich cultural and commercial life of the Vikings. Today, research and excavations of the Vikings allow us to better understand the true role of these ancient warriors in history and their legacy. My dear listeners, we will now focus on the origins and development of feudalism, another important turn in the depths of history. We will take a journey from the depths of the Dark Ages to the light. We will start from the fall of the Roman Empire to understand the birth and development of feudalism. If you are ready, let's embark on this fascinating journey and discover how the complex social structure of the Middle Ages came into being. The Roman Empire was once the greatest power in the Western world. With its cities, roads, and enormous military power, the empire maintained peace and order across vast territories. However, this great empire began to weaken in the face of internal conflicts, economic problems, and external pressures. By the early 5th century, the fall of the Roman Empire was inevitable. The fall of the Roman Empire led to a great vacuum in the West. This meant the collapse of the centralized government and military order that Rome had built up over many years. Rome's huge cities and great roads were gradually abandoned and security threats increased. People began to migrate from the big cities to the countryside. This collapse of the Roman Empire marked the beginning of a period of great change in Europe. Feudalism was born in this complex transition period. With the fall of the Roman Empire, central authority in Europe disappeared and local powers began to come to the fore. The sophisticated city life of ancient Rome gave way to simpler, localized governments. Landowners began to set up their own governments in their own lands to ensure local security. This process formed the cornerstones of feudalism. The feudal system was based on land ownership and loyalty relations. Land was under the control of a rich and powerful class, which established relationships with the peasants who worked their land and with vassals who provided military support. This new social order allowed wealthy landowners to rule over their land like a small kingdom. The birth of feudalism led to the spread of this kind of local and personal rule. To ensure the security and productivity of the landowners hired the services of peasants and soldiers. The peasants were obliged to cultivate the land in order to keep it cultivated and secure. In return, landowners promised to protect the peasants. In this period, one of the most important features of the feudal system was local and personal relationships. Landowners needed warriors, vassals, to protect their land. While the vassals served the landowners, they were also offered land or other privileges. These relationships created a web of security and loyalty that formed the basis of the feudal order. The development of feudalism also marked the transformation of the political and social structure in Europe. During this period, the weakening of central governments and the rise of local powers led to a more fragmented and stratified society. These structures also became key factors shaping the lives of the warrior aristocracy and peasants of the Middle Ages. My dear listeners, the fall of the Roman Empire and the subsequent rise of feudalism radically changed the social and political structure of Europe. This transformation marks an important turning point in European history and laid the foundations for the complex social order of the Middle Ages. Now, in the wake of these historical changes, we will take a deeper look at how feudalism developed and how medieval society took shape. I look forward to accompanying you on this fascinating journey through history. In the fascinating world of the Middle Ages, to understand the basic structure of feudalism, we must first examine the relationship between seigneur and vassal, two concepts that were at the heart of the feudal system and shaped the social structure of medieval Europe. Imagine that you live in a large stone castle. This castle serves not only as a home, but also as the center of a region. The owner of the castle is a seigneur. A seigneur is a person who owns vast territories and has the power to govern them. A seigneur is someone who owns the villages and towns in his territory and is responsible for their security. Seigneurs usually come from noble families and own large territories. However, a seigneur alone cannot rule all these lands and peasants. This is where vassals come into play. Vassals can be defined as people who live on the seigneur's land and serve him. In feudal relations, vassals usually receive land or privileges from the seigneur. In return, vassals provide military services and fulfill the needs of the seigneur. These services may be military support, advice, or administrative tasks. The vassal-seigneur relationship is a web of loyalties shaped by mutual obligations and rights. Vassals obey their suzerain's call and fight in his defense. Seigneurs, in turn, provide their vassals with land, justice, and sometimes material aid. The relationship is based on trust and loyalty. The vassal remains loyal and serves the seigneur, while the seigneur provides the vassal with the necessary protection and support. These relationships formed the cornerstones of the feudal order in the Middle Ages and had a major impact on the social structure. The feudal system is not only a military, but also a social and economic system of allegiance. Since vassals are obliged to ensure the security of their seigneur, these loyalty relations are also seen as part of the social order. In the feudal system, land was at the center of everything. The lands of the seigneurs were not only their property, but also the basis of the local economy and social structure. These lands are the center of production, taxation, and loyalty relations. In the economic structure of feudalism, land ownership stands out as the determining element of social and economic relations. Land administration is a reflection of the relations between seigneurs and vassals. Seigneurs provide management and control by dividing their lands to various vassals. These vassals usually live in villages or towns attached to their seigneur's land. The cultivation and management of the land is the responsibility of the vassals. The vassals cultivate and produce on these lands. In return, they pay taxes to the landowners and provide certain services. Land management and agriculture are the cornerstones of the economic structure of medieval Europe. Agriculture is at the center of the feudal economy and is the most important production activity in this period. Feudal landowners met their own needs by taking part of the produce from the peasants. At the same time, the peasants support their economic interests by working on the lands of their seigneurs. In feudal land administration, economic activities such as tax collection and provision of services are among the most important powers of the seigneur. The landowner receives a certain portion of the produce from the peasants, and with this income he ensures his own standard of living. The peasants, on the other hand, make a living by cultivating the land and work in a certain order within this system. In the feudal economy, land ownership and agricultural activities form the basis of the entire economic structure. The complexity of this structure plays a major role in understanding the social and economic order of the Middle Ages. The relations between seigneurs and vassals are important factors determining economic activities and social order. My dear listeners, we will now step into one of the most glamorous and legendary aspects of the Middle Ages, the world of chivalry. In this episode, I will delve deeper into chivalry and the military order and tell you about the warrior spirit, training and tournaments of that era. Let's begin this fascinating journey into the world of the brave knights of the Middle Ages who wore their shields and armor. In the gloomy and at the same time exciting atmosphere of the Middle Ages, the time a young man spends on his way to becoming a knight is like the beginning of a legend. Becoming a knight required not only physical strength and combat skill, but also courage, honor, and moral values. Knightly training was a long and arduous process, during which young men were prepared both physically and mentally. A young man would begin his training as a child with a lord or knightly family, usually around the age of 10. This period of training is called page. The young men, called pages, served in the castle in various capacities, learning the intricacies of noble life. They learned not only martial arts, but also ethics, etiquette, manners, and, in short, noble life. These years were the cornerstone of their future journey of knighthood. After this training, which began at a young age, when they were about 15 years old, they were called musketeers. Musketeers began to train as true warriors, studying various fighting techniques, swordsmanship skills, and the intricacies of wearing armor. In addition, as mounted warriors, they had to master riding horses, shooting arrows, and wielding spears. The training of the musketeers was very demanding and was often supplemented by actual combat drills. The process of becoming a knight was not only a physical preparation, but also a spiritual and moral journey. After completing his training, usually at the age of 18, the knight candidate would take a knightly oath to receive the title of knight. This oath was a very solemn and sacred moment. When taking this oath, the young knights would gather peacefully in a church or other holy place and pledge before God and the church to uphold values such as justice, courage, and nobility. This ceremony would be very spectacular, and remarkable young knights would be invested with their armor and swords and, upon taking this oath, would be recognized as true knights. Chivalry had an important place not only on the battlefield, but also in social and civic life. Knights were not only warriors but also social leaders and had a certain status in society. Therefore, tournaments organized to improve their combat skills were of great importance, not only to show their combat skills, but also as a social event. Tournaments were large and grand events where knights could showcase both their skill and courage. These events were usually held in a square or a large open space. At tournaments, knights would often compete against each other in jousts, sword fights, and other war games. These tournaments not only tested the physical skills of knights, but also provided an opportunity to defend their honor and increase their social status. During the tournaments, large crowds would gather and spectators would come to watch the exciting fights. At these events, knights would not only have fun, but also practice and improve their combat skills. tournaments functioned as a kind of training ground for knights and provided an opportunity to prepare for real battles. Knights gained fame, reputation, and prestige for their achievements in tournaments. In addition to tournaments, regular military training also played an important role. These trainings were conducted to improve the knights' skills on the battlefield and to increase their strategic thinking abilities. Knights would work on battle tactics, strategic planning, and leadership skills. These trainings were considered as an important stage to improve their performance on the battlefield and to effectively fight against their enemies. Dear listeners, we will now take you on a journey through perhaps one of the most dramatic and fascinating events of the Middle Ages, the Crusades. During this period, the knights took up the sword not only to fight, but also to defend their faith and sacred lands. The events that unfolded, the blood spilled on the battlefields, and the indescribable dedication that went into these campaigns have echoed through the depths of history. Now, get ready to discover together the story of the Crusades and the knights who played a part in them. As the 11th century drew to a close, voices from the various kingdoms of Europe were calling for the recapture of the Holy Land. Jerusalem and other holy cities were controlled by Muslims, and this caused great unrest in Christian Europe. The papacy encouraged the Christian world to unite and take action to reclaim these lands. Following this call, knights and soldiers from across Europe set out to take part in a series of military campaigns known as the Crusades. The First Crusade was launched in 1096 by Pope Urbanus II. When the Pope called for Christians to come together to reclaim the Holy Land, there was a massive response from across Europe. The early stages of this campaign involved a series of popular movements and military units, often traveling from Europe. There was a period of fierce preparation in the cities, villages, and towns along the way. Participants listened to sermons and prepared themselves spiritually as they prepared for this holy journey. One of the most important targets of the Crusades was Jerusalem. Jerusalem was considered an extremely holy city for Christians because it was believed that Jesus Christ was crucified there. These campaigns to capture Jerusalem were not only a military campaign but also a religious duty. The return of Jerusalem to Christian rule was considered a great victory for both the papacy and the Christian world. The knights were at the center of the Crusades and played an important role in these great military campaigns. As warriors, the knights contributed not only with their physical strength but also with their spiritual motivation. Each of them set out to participate in the Crusades with the mission to glorify God's name and protect the Holy Land. During the Crusades, various orders of knights were founded. These orders had both a military and a religious purpose. One of the most well-known was the Knights Templar, founded in Jerusalem and later influential in many parts of Europe. This order functioned both as warriors and as monastic monks. The Knights Templar played a major role in the defense of the Holy Land and were at the forefront of many victorious battles. The Knights experienced great hardships and sacrifices during the Crusades. They faced many obstacles such as long and difficult journeys, famine, and disease. However, despite all these difficulties, many knights did their best to achieve their goals without compromising their beliefs. Their struggles were considered not only as military successes, but also as spiritual achievements. The role of the knights during this period had a significant impact not only on the battlefield, but also in social and cultural terms. During the campaigns, cultural and commercial exchanges between Europe and the Middle East increased. As the knights explored new territories, they met different cultures, and these interactions contributed to the knowledge and cultural wealth of both sides. Moreover, the wars and conquests during this period led to the strengthening of some regional powers and kingdoms in Europe. The Crusades had a profound impact not only militarily and religiously, but also socially and culturally. With the success of the First Crusade, Jerusalem and the other holy cities returned to Christian rule. However, these victories did not last long, and many new campaigns were organized in the aftermath of the Crusades. In the years following these campaigns, it was difficult for the Crusaders to establish a permanent rule over the Holy Land. The Crusades left a lasting impact on the history of medieval Europe. The cultural and commercial interactions brought about by the Crusades expanded Europe's trade routes and paved the way for new geographical discoveries. At the same time, the wars and conflicts during the Crusades reshaped relations between the Middle East and Europe. My dear listeners, I will now take you deeper into the social structure of the Middle Ages, a period characterized by a social order in which kings, knights, peasants, and serfs were interconnected in a complex web. The important contributions that each class made to the fabric of medieval society, their ways of life and power dynamics, tell us much about this period of history. We will now explore this complex social structure and examine in detail the social hierarchy of the Middle Ages. At the apex of medieval Europe were kings and feudal lords who laid the foundations of social order. As absolute rulers of their kingdoms, kings ran the political and military affairs of the entire country. These high-ranking individuals were not only rulers, but also responsible for the protection of the nation and the maintenance of order. The power of kings was strengthened by their leadership in wars and conquests. However, in order to maintain their power, their relations with feudal lords were also very important. Feudal lords were large landowners who ruled the lands under the sovereignty of kings. Kings often granted lands to feudal lords, enabling them to keep these lands under their rule. Feudal lords gained great economic power with the products they obtained from the peasants and serfs living on these lands. This reinforced the social and economic dominance of kings and feudal lords. Feudal lords often owned large castles, which functioned as both military and administrative centers. The relationship between kings and feudal lords created a strong social and political hierarchy. Another important part of feudal society was the knights, known as the warrior class. Knights, as warriors of kings and feudal lords, were usually individuals of high socio-economic status. The duty of knights was to protect their lords' lands, to be at the forefront of battles, and to contribute to the maintenance of feudal order. Knights had military training and specialized in swordplay and battle strategies. At the same time, they embraced values such as loyalty, courage, and honor through the oath of knighthood. With their training and combat experience, knights gained significant respect and power in medieval society. During this period, social competition and tournaments among knights were an opportunity to show not only their military skills but also their social status. Tournaments not only showcased the knights' martial skills, but were also social events that added color to the social life of this period. However, not only knights but also various military units were important parts of this period. These soldiers served with great dedication as part of the war strategies of kings and lords. Their lives were often characterized by battles, sieges, and military campaigns. Peasants and serfs, the largest part of feudal society, laid the economic and social foundation of medieval Europe. Peasants were those who worked on the lands of feudal lords and delivered the produce to them. Depending on the feudal system, these peasants usually had to cultivate a small part of their land and give the rest to their lords. Agriculture was the main source of livelihood for the peasants, and therefore village life was shaped around an economy based on agriculture. The life of peasants was often simple and hard. In addition to agricultural work, peasants sometimes performed various obligatory services. These included working on their lord's land and fulfilling various taxes and obligations. Peasants mostly lived in their own villages, participated in agricultural work with their families, and were involved in social activities. Serfs, on the other hand, were peasants who formed the lowest stratum of the feudal system and were generally restricted in their freedom. Serfs worked as slaves on their lord's land and generally had no freedom of movement. Serfs, who lived in bondage on the lands of feudal lords, made economic contributions to their lords, but had little chance of acquiring property or gaining their freedom on their own. During this period, the life of peasants and serfs was hard and limited. However, their labor played a critical role in the functioning of feudal society and the maintenance of economic order. The complexity and social hierarchy of the feudal order required each individual to serve as part of the social structure. My dear listeners, the social structure of the Middle Ages reflects the dominance of great and powerful kings and knights on the one hand, and a social order shaped by the labor of peasants and serfs on the other. The complexity of this period has left unforgettable traces in the depths of history and contributed significantly to our understanding of the social structure of medieval Europe. Let's talk a little bit about the justice structure of the feudal system. The justice system of the Middle Ages was quite distinct as part of the feudal structure. Feudal courts played a central role in maintaining social order. Justice in these courts was usually administered by local lords. A feudal lord was responsible for administering justice in the lands he owned, and he also administered the courts. These courts were local judicial bodies established to ensure social harmony, punish crimes, and maintain social order. The courts were usually composed of a jury of prominent members of the local community. The jurors would make a decision based on the local environment and the social context in which the offender committed the crime. However, there was controversy about whether this system was fair, as justice was often shaped by the personal perspectives of feudal lords and social hierarchies. This meant that justice was often influenced by social status and personal relationships. Knights played an important role, not only on the battlefield, but also in the administration of justice. Chivalric courts were special courts, usually set up to try the cases of nobles and knights. In these courts, the administration of justice was seen as part not only of the law, but also of the knightly code and sense of honor. Honor trials played an important role in chivalric courts. Such trials dealt with issues of personal honor and glory. An act or crime that dishonored a knight could be judged not only legally, but also socially and morally. The code of chivalry was shaped by values such as courage, honesty, and loyalty, and violations of these values could lead to serious consequences. Such courts functioned to uphold social norms, often dealing with irregularities and personal insults. The medieval understanding of crime and punishment reflects the social and cultural values of the time. Crimes were often judged on the grounds of disrupting social order and undermining the authority of feudal lords. Crimes included acts of theft, murder, violence, and treason. Each of these crimes was punished in different ways according to the sense of justice of the time. The penal system was often based on execution and punishment. In the Middle Ages, the punishments meted out to criminals were often a public warning. For example, criminals were often punished in front of the public, receiving severe penalties and sometimes even the death penalty. However, for some crimes, lighter punishments were applied. For example, certain offenses could be punishable by payment of fines, slavery, or various services. Given that in the medieval understanding of justice, crimes and punishments were intended to preserve social order, punishments could sometimes be cruel and brutal. Some of these punishments were imposed in order to intimidate criminals against society. For example, it was quite common to torture the bodies of criminals or to punish them in public places. My dear friends, I will now take you on a journey through the late Middle Ages, where we will examine in detail the complex process of feudalism's weakening and eventual collapse. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, major changes, crises, and social upheavals in Europe shook the foundations of the feudal order. Let us follow the traces of this period of great transformation and see how feudalism unraveled and new power dynamics emerged. By the middle of the century, there was a period of great crisis that hung over Europe like a dark cloud. This is the name of a crisis in which Europe experienced its darkest moments, a crisis that radically affected the social structure, the Black Death, or the Plague. The plague was a terrible epidemic that began in 1347 and swept across the continent. It rapidly wiped out people, ravaged cities and villages, and radically changed the demographics of the continent. The plague affected not only public health but also the feudal order. The loss of a large part of the workforce placed a heavy burden on peasants and serfs. It became difficult to cultivate the fields, pay taxes, and maintain daily life. The reduction in labor increased the value of peasants and serfs and in some regions led to revolts. These revolts caused feudal lords to question their authority and reconsider their economic structure. Another important part of this period of crisis was the wars. A long and bloody conflict known as the 100 Years' War lasted from 1337 to 1453. These wars, fought between France and England, consumed vast resources, increased military expenditure, and led to social unrest. The devastation of the wars led to the economic decline of many regions and the weakening of the feudal system. Another factor that deepened this crisis was various rebellions and social unrest. Movements such as the Peasants' Revolt in England 1381 and the Jacquerie Revolt in France 1358 were reactions to the hardships faced by peasants and workers. These revolts made the sustainability of the feudal order even more difficult and led to the lower segments of society becoming a rebellious mass. With the weakening of feudalism, radical changes began in Europe. The rise of trade in cities in this period was one of the important factors that brought the feudal order to an end. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, especially in the 13th and 14th centuries, the development of trade routes and the growth of cities accelerated in various parts of Europe. The increase in trade was particularly evident in Italy and Flanders. In these regions, trade cities grew and became important trade centers. Cities became a new source of power, both economically and socially. The rise of cities led to the emergence of a bourgeois class that questioned the authority of feudal lords and increased their economic independence. This bourgeois class developed an economic and social structure outside the feudal order. The rise of cities and trade also gave artisans and merchants a stronger position in society. Artisans and merchants formed their own guilds and exerted a great influence on economic activity in the cities. This became a factor limiting the economic and political power of feudal lords. The decline of feudalism is also directly related to the strengthening of centralized kingdoms. In the 14th and 15th centuries, centralized kingdoms began to gain power in Europe, creating a political structure that questioned the sovereignty of feudal lords. Kingdoms such as France, England, and Spain limited the powers of feudal lords by establishing a centralized administration in their territories. In this process, the kingdoms strengthened their centralized governments through military and financial reforms. Military reforms led to the formation of professional armies, which reduced the military power of feudal lords. Fiscal reforms, on the other hand, centralized tax systems and allowed the kingdoms to establish a more orderly fiscal structure. These reforms weakened the economic power of feudal lords and consolidated the supremacy of kingdoms. Moreover, the strengthening of centralized kingdoms eliminated the complexity of the feudal system and the disorganization of local governments. By centralizing laws and administrative systems, kingdoms ensured more effective governance. This led to the weakening and eventual collapse of the feudal order. My dear friends, these great transformations at the end of the Middle Ages clearly show how feudalism was weakened and replaced by centralized kingdoms. The plague, wars, rebellions, the rise of trade, and the strengthening of centralized kingdoms accelerated the downfall of the feudal order. My dear friends, I will now take you deep back in time. to the heart of the Kingdom of Wessex and the epic story of Alfred the Great. In this chapter I will detail the story of Alfred from his youth, through his ascension to the throne of Wessex and his first great struggles. Alfred's story is a symbol not just of a king, but of how the fate of a nation was changed. If you are ready, let's take an in-depth exploration of this important figure in our history. The year 849 in the south of England, in the lands of the Kingdom of Wessex, a generational change was taking place. Wessex was known as one of the most powerful and influential kingdoms of its time. Alfred's father, King Aethelwulf, was the ruler of Wessex and struggled to keep the kingdom safe. Aethelwulf's reign was a difficult time, as the kingdom had to withstand Viking raids from Norway and Denmark. The Kingdom of Wessex under King Aethelwulf required bold and strategic leadership. Wessex's borders were under constant threat from the Vikings, and so Aethelwulf took important steps to secure his kingdom. As a prince born in these dangerous times, Alfred would become an important figure for the future of the kingdom. Alfred's childhood was overshadowed by the complex and dangerous circumstances of the time. From an early age, he received specialized training for his future role. His education was meticulously planned, not only to be fit for royal life, but also to develop military and strategic skills. Alfred's education was shaped not only by the splendor of the court, but also by military tactics and strategy. Young Alfred studied under some of the most important sages and clerics of the time. Along with his knowledge of religion and philosophy, he also received in-depth training in martial arts and strategy. These trainings gave him the opportunity to develop his leadership and management skills. At a young age, Alfred began to develop his knowledge of the administration of the kingdom and his ability to think strategically. At the same time, he received cultural and religious knowledge, as well as training in the martial arts, thus honing his future leadership skills. After Alfred's teenage years, the death of his father, King Aethelwulf, in 856 left a great vacuum in the kingdom. Alfred's older brother Ethelbert succeeded to the throne of the Kingdom of Wessex. But shortly after Ethelbert's death in 860, Alfred took over the kingdom. Alfred's ascension to the throne was the beginning of a great trial, both kingly and personal. For Alfred, it was not only the beginning of the rule of the kingdom, but also the beginning of the struggle against the Viking raids. At a time when Wessex was under constant threat from the Vikings, Alfred's administrative skills and military strategies were of great importance. In his first struggle, Alfred had to resist the invasions of the Vikings and ensure the security of his kingdom. Alfred's first battle took place in 878. The Vikings had attacked the vulnerable areas of Wessex and seriously threatened the kingdom. Alfred developed a grand strategy for the defense of his kingdom during this period. The measures King Alfred took during this critical period were aimed at increasing the resilience of his kingdom, both militarily and socially. In this process, Alfred's military acumen and leadership skills proved to be a major turning point for the future of his kingdom. As the 8th century drew to a close, a frightening danger from the sea loomed on the north and east coasts of England. This danger was the Vikings, strong and brave warriors who came by sea. The Vikings' impact on England was shaped by their efforts to control the continent's sea routes. These raids swept through various parts of England, including the Kingdom of Wessex. During this period, the Kingdom of Wessex faced constant attacks and threats from the Vikings. These raids penetrated into the interior of Wessex, targeting villages, towns, and monasteries. The Vikings were naval warriors, known for their iron armor and large ships, which gave them the advantage of being able to move quickly from sea to land and attack suddenly. These sudden and effective attacks put the Kingdom of Wessex under great threat. The Vikings were particularly known for their raids on monasteries. Monasteries were not only religious centers, but also economic and cultural centers. The Vikings' attacks on monasteries targeted not only religious leaders but also all strata of society. These attacks caused great destruction, both economically and spiritually. The Kingdom of Wessex's struggle against these threats tested its military and strategic capacity. In this difficult period, the Kingdom of Wessex had to develop various strategies to counter the Viking raids and protect its territory. In the midst of the conflict with the Vikings, Alfred the Great's leadership and strategic acumen would decide the fate of the Kingdom of Wessex. From a young age, Alfred had an extensive knowledge of military training and strategy. He felt a great responsibility for the kingdom and developed a strong defensive strategy to counter the Viking raids. The most important elements of Alfred's defensive strategies were to strengthen the kingdom's defensive line and create an effective resistance to the Vikings' attacks. First, Alfred launched a series of military and engineering works to strengthen the defense lines in the coastal areas of Wessex. He built towers, fortifications, and defensive points to increase coastal defenses. These structures strengthened the kingdom's defenses by making it more difficult for the Vikings to move quickly inland from the coast. Another of Alfred's defensive strategies was to create a series of military camps and settlements in the interior of England. These camps helped to prevent the Vikings from infiltrating the interior and at the same time increase the defensive capabilities of the local population. Alfred's strategy ensured that the local population could fight back in an organized way and support the kingdom. Another of Alfred's tactics was to use guerrilla tactics and small-scale attacks in conflicts with the Vikings rather than direct open warfare. Instead of confronting large and organized groups of Vikings, Alfred adopted a strategy of restricting their movements and constantly pushing them back. This tactic succeeded in reducing the Vikings' impact on the kingdom and increased the Kingdom of Wessex's defensive capacity. Let us now examine in detail Alfred the Great's military reforms and how they transformed Wessex's defense strategies. Alfred's reforms had a profound impact not only on the defense of his kingdom, but also on the history of England. I will tell you what happened during this period as if I were reliving those days. If you are ready, let's take a journey through Alfred's military reforms and defense strategies. Alfred the Great introduced sweeping military reforms and strategic changes to strengthen his kingdom's defense capacity in the fight against the Vikings. These reforms not only strengthened Wessex's existing defenses, but also changed the course of English history. By delving deeper into Alfred's military strategies and reforms, we can better understand the vision of this great leader. The challenges of facing the Vikings led Alfred to radically reorganize the military structure of the Kingdom of Wessex. Previously, Wessex's military structure was disorganized, but Alfred was able to streamline this system to create a more effective defense. Alfred reorganized the kingdom's military corps, enabling local governments and groups of fighters to act in a more coordinated way. Each village and town was assigned a specific obligation for military service. This system increased the kingdom's defenses and made it more resilient against any attack by the Vikings. This new military structure organized by Alfred was especially important during the Viking raids. In his military reforms, Alfred especially increased the participation of local people in the defense efforts. Each region formed its own defense corps, which worked in coordination with the central authority. These reforms increased Wessex's defensive capability and greatly strengthened its capacity to resist the Vikings. Perhaps one of the most important elements of Alfred's military reforms was the network of defensive fortresses in cities known as the Burgel system. This was one of the most important projects that reflected Alfred's strategic acumen and military leadership. The Burgel system consisted of defensive fortresses placed all over Wessex. These forts were designed not only as military defenses, but also as strategic points protecting trade routes in important cities. The structures of the castles were designed for both defense and offense. Each castle was equipped with high walls, moats, and strong defense systems. The construction of these fortresses also increased the territorial security of Wessex, helping to prevent the Vikings from infiltrating the interior. The burgh system provided not only a military defense, but also an important infrastructure for regional administration and local security. Castles were linked to villages and towns across the kingdom, extending the kingdom's defense capacity to all regions. Alfred's choice of locations for these castles greatly strengthened the kingdom's defenses. Each castle took responsibility for the defense of the surrounding area, while at the same time ensuring the safety of the local population. This system significantly increased the security of the kingdom, reducing the pressure of the Vikings on Wessex. Another important element of Alfred the Great's military reforms was the strengthening of the naval forces. The Vikings' raids by sea posed a great threat to Wessex. Therefore, Alfred decided to strengthen the naval forces and took various measures to improve the kingdom's sea defenses. Alfred's efforts to strengthen the naval forces included the construction of new and more effective warships. These ships were designed to counter the warships of the Vikings, giving them a great advantage in naval battles. Alfred ensured that these ships were designed to perform both offensive and defensive missions. Strengthening the naval forces increased Wessex's capacity to protect its coastal areas. These ships provided an effective defense against Viking raids by sea and secured the kingdom's sea lanes. By protecting the kingdom's maritime borders, Alfred's strategic move helped to reduce Viking pressure on Wessex. Alfred the Great's military reforms radically transformed the Kingdom of Wessex's defenses and led to significant successes in battles against the Vikings. By increasing the kingdom's defensive capacity, these reforms greatly strengthened its ability to resist the Vikings. Alfred's strategic acumen and leadership laid the foundations for an era that left its mark on history. Alfred the Great was not only a military leader, but also a cultural innovator and intellectual leader. In addition to strengthening the defenses of his kingdom, Alfred took important steps to improve the cultural and educational level of Wessex. These reforms reflect his vision and the importance he placed on knowledge. Let us now go back in time to witness the details of Alfred's educational and cultural reforms. At the heart of Alfred the Great's cultural reforms were innovations in education and science. These innovations aimed both to increase the educational level of the people of Wessex and to ensure the intellectual development of his kingdom. In the late 9th century, education and scholarship across Western Europe was often disorganized and limited. Alfred undertook a comprehensive educational reform to change this situation. First, churches and monasteries were restructured as educational institutions. Alfred ensured that these centers of learning taught not only religious but also secular knowledge. Education was made open not only to church members, but also to children of noble families. Alfred also provided support for scientific research and writing. In particular, he encouraged the spread of knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. These efforts contributed greatly to the intellectual life of Wessex, bringing knowledge to a wider audience. These innovations in education and science showed that Alfred's vision was not only military, but also intellectual and cultural. Another important component of Alfred's educational reforms was the translation of Latin works into English. In the 9th century, Latin was the language of intellectual and scientific work in Western Europe. However, translations were needed to make these works comprehensible to the masses. Alfred recognized this need and encouraged the translation of Latin works into English. In particular, Alfred encouraged translations of classical Latin texts and the works of the Church Fathers. These translations increased the Wessex people's access to intellectual and religious knowledge. The most famous of Alfred's translations is Bede's History of the Church. This translation brought historical information and church history to the people of Wessex. At the same time, his translations also increased interest in the Latin language, which was an important step in educational and intellectual development. Alfred's translation efforts enriched the cultural heritage of Wessex and raised the intellectual level of its people. Educational reforms increased access not only to intellectual knowledge, but also to cultural and religious knowledge. These efforts ensured that Alfred left a lasting legacy in the field of education. Alfred the Great made a great impact, not only through his reforms, but also through his own writings. His writings made a significant contribution to the intellectual life of the period and formed Alfred's literary legacy. One of Alfred's best-known writings are the works known as Alfred's translations. These works addressed both religious and secular topics and appealed to a wide audience. Alfred's writings were intended both to spread knowledge and to educate his people. In these works, Alfred's thoughts and vision are clearly visible. They also help us to understand the social and cultural context of the time. Alfred's literary contributions contributed greatly to the development of the English language. The works he wrote and translated enriched the English language in terms of literature. These contributions strengthened the cultural heritage of Wessex and made an important contribution to the literary history of England. Alfred the Great's cultural and educational reforms influenced the intellectual and cultural development not only of Wessex but of the whole of England. Innovations in education and science, translations of Latin works, and Alfred's writings show the breadth and depth of his vision. Alfred's reforms ensured that he is remembered as a leader who left his mark on history and enriched the cultural heritage of his kingdom in a lasting way. Alfred the Great was not only a military leader, but also a figure who played a critical role in ensuring England's national unity and building a strong kingdom. Alfred's strategic moves and reforms marked important turning points in Britain's history. Let us now try to understand Alfred's impressive legacy by examining the unification of England, the peace treaties with the Vikings, and Alfred's lasting legacy. Alfred the Great's influence on the kingdom was not only in defense of Wessex, but he also played a major role in securing the unity of England. By the late 9th century, England was fragmented by Viking raids and divided into several kingdoms. Alfred developed many strategies to unify this fragmented state and build a strong England. Alfred's first step was to ensure the security of Wessex. But his vision went beyond this. Wessex's success continued as Alfred strengthened its relations with other English kingdoms. By forging alliances with other kingdoms, Alfred used a combination of diplomatic and military strategies to ensure the unity of England. These alliances increased England's capacity to resist the Vikings and contributed to the strengthening of the kingdom. As an effective leader, Alfred's relations with other kingdoms helped reshape the political map of England. Alfred's kingdom also played an influential role in the rest of England and encouraged the expansion of the kingdom. In the process, Alfred's policies and strategies paved the way for England to become a more united and powerful nation. Alfred the Great's peace treaties with the Vikings were an important step in stabilizing England. Viking raids had caused great damage to various parts of England. Alfred made diplomatic attempts to make peace with the Vikings and developed clever strategies in the process. The first of these agreements was the Treaty of Nottingham in 878. It required the Vikings to withdraw from Wessex and give up certain lands. The treaty was considered a sign of Alfred's success and demonstrated his diplomatic skills. It was an important step towards regional stability for England. However, the peace treaties were only a relief for a time. Alfred worked carefully to ensure that this peace would last. The continuity of the treaties was a reflection of Alfred's diplomatic skills, as well as his military strength. By stabilizing relations with the Vikings, the peace treaties played an important role in keeping England at peace. Alfred the Great's legacy shaped one of the most important periods in England's history. His leadership and strategies laid the foundation not only for his own reign, but also for those that followed. Alfred's achievements influenced the most important developments in Britain's history and shaped the country's future. Alfred's legacy was not limited to his military and diplomatic achievements. His cultural and educational reforms made a significant contribution to the intellectual life of England. Educational innovations, translations of Latin works, and Alfred's writings strengthened England's cultural and intellectual accumulation. These reforms enriched England's intellectual heritage and provided a model for future leaders. Alfred's legacy is also associated with the unification and strengthening of the kingdom. His strategic moves and diplomatic engagement played a critical role in ensuring England's national unity. Alfred's vision and leadership shaped the future development of England and shaped the country's national identity. As a result, Alfred the Great's legacy remains one of the most important and influential figures in Britain's history. His military and diplomatic achievements, cultural and educational reforms contributed greatly to the development and strengthening of England. Alfred's leadership marks an important turning point in England's history, and his influence can be felt from the depths of history to the present day. Alfred the Great is a figure who represents an important turning point in the history of England. His death was not only a personal loss, but also the beginning of a critical period for the future of the kingdom and the country. Alfred's death took place on October 26, 899, at the royal palace in Winchester. The changes that followed his death, both in England's domestic and foreign affairs, demonstrated the depth of Alfred's legacy and the importance of his legacy. After Alfred the Great's death, his son Edward the Elder took over the kingdom. Edward tried to continue and expand on the foundations his father had laid. However, after Alfred's death, England's internal and external affairs became complex and needed to be handled with great care. Alfred's death brought a series of difficulties in relations with the Vikings. After Alfred's death, the Vikings resumed attacks, which forced the kingdom to reconsider its defense strategies and domestic policy. Edward continued the wars to preserve and expand his father's legacy and continued to implement the strategies left by Alfred. After Alfred the Great's death, the fight against the Vikings continued. The Vikings continued to be influential, especially in the Eastern Territories, requiring England to constantly improve its defense strategies. Edward the Elder, following in his father's footsteps, continued the war strategies against the Vikings and developed new methods of warfare. In addition to the fight against the Vikings, Edward's government placed great emphasis on preserving and expanding Alfred's legacy. In the process, Alfred's strategic moves, such as his efforts to protect defensive structures and fortresses like the Burgle system, were continued. These structures played an important role in strengthening the defensive position against the Vikings. Negotiations and peace treaties with the Vikings also continued after Alfred's death. These treaties were used as an important tool in managing relations with the Vikings and ensuring England's regional stability. However, the wishes and demands of the Vikings occasionally led them to interfere in England's internal affairs, necessitating a constant review of policy. Alfred the Great's legacy constitutes one of the most important and lasting influences on the history of England. His approach to government, military strategies, and cultural reforms contributed greatly to the development of England. The stability and security Alfred provided helped to unite the different kingdoms within England and bring about national unity. Alfred's cultural and educational reforms had a profound impact on the intellectual life of England. His translations of Latin works, his educational innovations, and his writings enriched England's cultural heritage. Alfred's writings and literary contributions shaped England's intellectual heritage and served as a resource for generations to come. Alfred's military reforms and defense strategies influenced not only his own era but also those that followed. Structures such as the Burgle system strengthened England's defenses and ensured the internal security of the kingdom. Alfred's strategies had a major impact on the defense policies of subsequent kingdoms. In conclusion, Alfred the Great's legacy is an important turning point in England's history. His leadership, military strategies, cultural reforms, and diplomatic skills contributed greatly to the development and strengthening of England. Developments since Alfred's death show how deep and enduring his legacy is. Alfred's role in the emergence of England as a powerful kingdom and the consolidation of national unity will be remembered and appreciated throughout history. Dear viewers, another historical journey has come to an end. From the dark and mysterious lands of the North to the complex social structure of the Middle Ages and the epic struggles led by Alfred the Great, we have explored a wide range of important topics. Now, in the light of this comprehensive historical journey, let us reflect on the information and conclusions we have gathered together. The Vikings, these warriors and explorers from across the dark seas, have gone down in history as one of the most fascinating figures not only in the history of Britain and Europe, but of the whole world. Their battles, discoveries, and cultural impact revealed them to be not only warriors, but also curious travelers and resourceful seafarers. These legendary children of the North left a lasting mark on the lands beyond the seas, blazing new trails and making their legacy forever influential. Turning to feudalism and chivalry, we explored how the social structure of the Middle Ages was shaped and how land administration, feudal relations, and military order developed. We tried to understand the complexity of feudal societies, the dynamics of seigneur and vassal relations, and how knights' military skills and social status were interconnected. We analyzed how feudalism determined the social and political structure of medieval Europe and how this structure evolved over the long term. As for Alfred the Great and his fight against the Vikings, we admired Alfred's courage, strategic acumen, and determination. His efforts to defend England against the Viking Raids showed that he was not only a warrior, but also a leader, a reformer, and a cultural pioneer. Alfred's military reforms, cultural contributions, and state-building innovations left a lasting impact on England's history and gave it a powerful legacy. From the dark seas of the Vikings, to the complexity of feudal societies, to the heroic story of Alfred the Great, I hope this video has increased your understanding of the depths of history and these complex issues. If this video has inspired you and you would like to explore more of these diverse aspects of history, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on your notifications. Share your comments and feedback with us. Your opinion is very valuable to us. We look forward to meeting you in the next video with new stories from different corners of history. We hope to meet again to make new discoveries in the depths of history. Goodbye and have a day full of history.